Today's webinar is going to cover the Systemic Safety Project Selection Tool and its applications for pedestrian safety. And we'll be speaking with Karen Scurry of the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety and Howard Preston of CH2M Hill. My name is Dan Jeline, and I'm the Program Manager at the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Attendees, if you can hear us, click the hand in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to raise your hand so that we can be sure that you can hear us. I'll give you all a moment to raise your hand so that we can make sure we're all on the same page here. Great. All the hands going up. Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we get started with today's webinar, I just want to go over a few administrative details about the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, just reload the website and log back into the program, and you should be able to rejoin the session. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar today. Though you won't be able to speak, you will have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here, and I'll monitor these questions and respond to you if I'm able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but will not be addressed until the end of the program, when we've built in around 20 minutes for a discussion period. Please feel free to ask those questions as we go along, and we'll get to them after the presentation. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrows. Also, when you exit the webinar, there will be a very brief survey that will pop up. We very much appreciate your feedback on our performance today. Following the webinar today, you'll receive a follow-up email. The email will include a link to download a Principal's Certificate of Attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward this link to the other participants so that they can download and print the certificate with their names. This email will also include a link to the website where you can download a PDF copy of the slides from today's presentation. We'll be posting a video archive of the presentation 1 or 2 weeks after the webinar. The webinar has been submitted to the AICP and may be approved for 1.5 CM credits. The Road Safety Academy, which is the training and education arm of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, is a registered provider of CM credits. For more information on the Road Safety Academy, you can visit www.rsa.unc.edu. For more information on future webinars or to view the archives from this webinar series and others, please visit www.walkinginfo.org/webinars. And in addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at www.walkinginfo.org/training. Now, while our first presenter is getting set up with the presentation, I wanted to take a quick poll of the audience to find out how many people from your site are joining us today. So if you can take a moment and vote in our poll, let us know if it's just you watching the webinar from your location, if you have 2 or 3 people with you, or if you have several other folks from your office as well. I'll leave the poll open for just a few minutes while everyone gets a chance to vote. We really appreciate your feedback. Okay, thank you all so much for your feedback. I'd like to welcome and thank all of our presenters for agreeing to speak with us today. And Karen, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and get started with your presentation.
Great, thank you, Dan. Are you seeing my screen?
I do.
Okay, thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. We are very excited to speak to you about the systemic approach to safety. We've seen tremendous success in rural and local applications of the systemic approach to safety, and we believe very strongly that this approach can add value to pedestrian safety programs as well. And so I'm very excited to be able to be here and to speak to you about the systemic approach to safety. Just to give you a little outline of what you can expect over the next hour, hour and a half, as Dan mentioned, there are 2 presentations today. I'll start by providing some background information related to the systemic approach to safety and then introduce the Systemic Safety Project Selection Tool. And that's really just to lay the framework for the Minnesota case study that will be presented by Howard Preston when I'm through here. At the conclusion of Howard's presentation, before the Q&A session that Dan talked about, we'll have a brief participant exercise, and this is really to get your input on pedestrian-related risk factors. And if you don't know what that means yet, don't worry, you'll have a better handle on that by the time we get through these 2 presentations. So just to get us started, over the past 15 years or so, between 4,000 and 5,000 pedestrians have lost their lives in crashes involving motor vehicles each year. And while 2011 witnessed the fewest motor vehicle deaths since 1949, the number of pedestrian and bicycle traffic deaths rose in 2011. And what we know about these tragedies is that 73% of pedestrian fatalities occur in urban areas and 79% of pedestrian fatalities occur at non-intersection locations. So if you can consider and imagine the number of urban non-intersection miles across the nation, you'll quickly realize that these pedestrian fatalities are widely dispersed across a wide network of roads. We're talking thousands and thousands of miles of roads. So it's often very difficult to isolate locations with a high number of pedestrian crashes. So there are really two basic approaches to improve pedestrian safety, and this is in my mind anyway. We can be proactive and we can plan and design our roadways to accommodate all road users, and we're getting better at this with initiatives like Complete Streets and livability initiatives. But even if we plan and design all of our new projects to accommodate pedestrians, we must still address our existing safety issues, and we do that most commonly through a safety management process. And the safety management process might identify specific high crash locations or corridors, which is more likely the case when we're talking about pedestrian safety. It might also identify targeted areas to improve pedestrian safety, like a pedestrian safety zone or something like that. Or an agency might choose to implement a particular countermeasure across an entire jurisdiction. We've seen this with counting on pedestrian signals and things like that. But if you don't have a sufficient budget to employ it everywhere approach, a risk-based or systemic approach can help you identify those locations that may be at more risk for a potential crash than another. So the systemic approach is really where we're going to focus our discussion today, if you didn't get that from the title of today's webinar. So you're probably asking yourself, what do we mean by a systemic approach to safety? Well, a systemic safety improvement is defined as an improvement that is widely implemented based on high-risk roadway features that are correlated with particular severe crash types. And the key term here, and one that you'll hear a lot about over the next hour or so, is this idea of high-risk roadway features. And we identify those features based on their correlation with a particular severe crash type. And for our purposes today, those crash types are pedestrian related. So several years ago, Federal Highway initiated an effort to develop a systemic safety project selection tool. And the purpose of this effort was to develop information to help agencies implement this systemic approach to safety. And one thing I do want to emphasize is even though we call it a tool, the information is presented in the form of a process. So there is no software or there are no Excel spreadsheets or anything like that to walk you through this process. It's really, we develop the process and then agencies can implement that process in their existing safety management programs as they best see fit. So as you see here, the tool includes three main components. The first is the systemic planning process, which is shown here in blue. And this provides step-by-step instructions and illustrative examples to identify and prioritize systemic safety improvement projects. The second element of the tool presents a mechanism for agencies to determine the appropriate balance of funding between site analysis or hotspot high crash locations and systemic projects, which is shown here in green. And then lastly, the tool presents various techniques to evaluate systemic safety improvements. And today's webinar will focus mainly on the systemic planning process, so that process that's shown in blue. But I will briefly introduce the funding and evaluation element because it's all key components of the systemic safety project selection tool and safety management processes in general. So element one of the tool is the systemic safety planning process, which is shown here. And it consists of four primary steps. First, you would identify your target crash types and potential risk factors. Then you screen and prioritize your candidate locations. Then you select your countermeasures and end by prioritizing your projects for implementation. So this is very similar to a traditional safety management process. So I'm going to then walk through each of these steps just to give you an idea of the type of analysis that is included in each step. And then as Howard walks through the case study, I think you'll see how it's actually implemented in practice. So systemic problem identification, that first step of the planning process, involves identifying focus crash types and the commonly associated location characteristics. And this is done using a system-wide crash analysis. So you analyze your system data and then identify the crash characteristics at the system level. So the first step is to refine the focus from all crash types to a few target crash types for the entire system or subregion if you're a county or a district within a state. And the strategic highway safety planning process that's already in place in all of the states offers a good place to begin when identifying statewide priority crash types. And I know for the target audience here today, the focus crash type will likely be pedestrian crashes. But the next question will be, okay, so we know we have a pedestrian safety issue, but where are those crashes occurring? And so through additional analysis, we better understand the facility type that is associated with those state or region-wide priority crash types. We then look at the location characteristics, so the roadway geometry, traffic control devices, and in the case of pedestrian safety, I think some information related to pedestrian behavior and those sorts of things, and identify which of those characteristics are commonly linked with severe focus crash types on those facilities. And these are your potential risk factors. And these are just some examples of potential risk factors for roadway and intersection features. And if you look closely, you'll likely see some that could specifically be associated with pedestrian crashes. And if you're having trouble seeing them, I'm going to highlight just a few for you. So shoulder width and surface type, presence of lighting, presence of right and left turn lanes at intersections, whether or not right turn on red is permitted at an intersection. These are examples of risk factors that might influence or be associated with pedestrian crashes. These are examples of some other risk factors that might be associated with pedestrian crashes specifically. And I want you to keep these in mind and consider which might be more prevalent based on your experience, just your work experience in general, your experience in working with pedestrian-related data. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll have a participant exercise after the presentations to get your input on pedestrian-related risk factors. So having looked at the aggregate data from a macro level, it's now important to ask ourselves, are all elements of the system equally at risk for the targeted crash type, or are some more at risk than others? And to answer this question, you screen and prioritize the elements based on the number of risk factors present at each location. So the highest priority locations become the list of candidate locations for safety investment. And once you have that candidate list of locations for safety investment, the next step is then to identify potential countermeasures to implement at those locations. And when addressing crash types experiencing low densities but in high aggregate numbers like pedestrian crashes, we need to look for low-cost solutions. That way they can be widely deployed across the system in order to address a large number of locations and ideally provide a significant crash reduction. So it does, and I will emphasize that they don't always have to be low cost. There may be some instances where a higher cost strategy or countermeasure might be more appropriate for a particular location, and so you can include some of those in your list of strategies for the target crash type. So once initial strategies have been identified, you would evaluate them based on effectiveness, implementation costs, and of course your agency's policies, practices, and experiences. And in the end, you'll end up with this short list of strategies for each target crash type. And Howard will cover a lot of specific pedestrian countermeasures and resources, but I did want to point out a great resource for pedestrian countermeasure information, and that's PedSafe. It's the Pedestrian Safety Guide and Countermeasure Selection System. And I'm not saying this because it's a resource that Federal Highway developed, but more because the interactive matrices, and I have an example of one shown here, would be extremely helpful for the countermeasure identification process. And while it might be difficult to see here, The matrices are organized by crash type, so along the left side is the crash types, and then recommended countermeasures for each crash type across the top. So it provides you some direction when you're trying to identify potential countermeasures to address your target crash type. So I think this would be a great resource, and as I mentioned, Howard is going to point you to a couple of others as well. So a key feature of the systemic process is that you're not selecting countermeasures for implementation at individual locations, rather for widespread implementation on similar facilities. And a decision process is needed for each countermeasure selected for each crash type. So this is an example of one such decision process, and this example is not specific to pedestrians, but Howard will show you a pedestrian-specific example. And so you apply a decision process like this to each site to identify the specific countermeasure and develop safety projects. Those safety projects are then prioritized for implementation based on various factors such as environment, right-of-way, constructability issues, time frame, public outreach, and of course funding availability is always a consideration in that prioritization process. And while there are many ways to fund safety projects, the Highway Safety Improvement Program is a core federal aid program with the purpose to reduce fatalities and serious injuries on all public roads, and that would include those that involve pedestrians. The HSIP provides $2.4 billion annually to improve roadway safety through the implementation of primarily infrastructure-related improvements, although MAP 21 did expand HSIP eligibility to non-infrastructure activities as well. And so I just had a real quick question for the participants online today. So Dan, if you could go ahead and bring that up.
Yep, it should be up now.
Okay, I'll take your word for it because I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah, you don't see it, but yeah, people are voting now. So this question involves just asking whether your agencies are using HSIP funds for pedestrian safety projects. So just a few choices: yes, no, or I don't know. We're just curious about whether these funds are being used for pedestrian safety projects in your area. You can let us know about that. That would be great. And what I can do once I close the poll is I can share the results with everybody too, just in case you're all interested. We'll wait until everyone's had a chance to vote.
That would be great. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, let's see if I can share this with everybody. All right, so you should now be able to see the poll results. It looks like yes, we had 44% answer yes, 23% answer no, and 33% answer I don't know. So that's great to see almost half of the people or agencies are using those funds for pedestrian safety.
Yes, that is very exciting and very different from my experience with the HSIP. So thank you for responding to that poll. It's great to see that folks are taking advantage of the HSIP as a resource to implement pedestrian safety improvements. I think the systemic approach to safety really provides another mechanism for those projects to compete for HSIP funds. The foundation of the HSIP is the roadway safety management process, which is what we've used for the systemic safety planning process. And a comprehensive safety management process, including the HSIP, will consist of both traditional site analysis, which is your high crash locations, and systemic approaches. And so the systemic approach to safety does not replace the traditional site analysis approach. We still need to address our high crash locations. But the question becomes, how do we distribute our limited safety funds between improvements at these high crash locations as well as more proactive systemic safety improvements? And so the systemic safety project selection tool, the element 2 of the tool, provides a decision-making framework for agencies to help agencies through this process. It's not a formula, so you don't input a couple of variables and outcomes and answer. It's more of a series of considerations for agencies to walk through, and those considerations are shown here. I know it might be a little bit difficult to see, but just some examples. You know, do you have a lot of high crash locations or just a few? If you have a few, maybe a systemic approach is more appropriate. Is your performance measure all crashes? If it is, then chances are, you might be more readily able to identify those high crash locations. If you're only looking at severe crashes, the systemic approach might be more appropriate. So the tool walks you through a series of considerations and in the end helps you identify what that distribution of safety investments might look like for your agency. So this is part of the tool. We won't hear too much more about this today, but this is just something to keep in mind as you're programming your projects for implementation. And the last element of the tool describes techniques to conduct a systemic safety program evaluation. Evaluation is the key to the success of any program, and as it can tell you what works, what doesn't work, where changes might be necessary. And the tool describes various approaches to systemic program evaluation, and this includes both output and outcome-oriented evaluation. So on the output side, the evaluation can tell you whether you're spending your resources as you had intended. And the outcome, you can really look at program-level trends. You can look at the safety effectiveness of treated facilities, as well as the cost effectiveness of those countermeasure implementations. And then lastly, look at the performance of your countermeasures. Are they performing as expected, and what were the benefits of implementing those countermeasures on a systemic basis? So these two elements are included in the Systemic Safety Project Selection Tool, which will be available on our website probably, I'd say, in the next month or so. Maybe I'm being a little optimistic, but in the next month or two, the Systemic Safety Project Selection Tool will be available on our website. And that website is directly linked from Federal Highways Office of Safety website with the link provided here. And I think Dan is going to share this link at the end as well. But at the beginning of this calendar year, the Office of Safety launched this website, the Systemic Approach to Safety Using Risk to Drive Action. And the website provides a lot of general information about the systemic approach to safety. It describes why an agency should consider advancing implementation of this approach as part of their safety management process. It lists potential risk factors, provides examples of the systemic approach to safety in practice, and provides additional resources to assist you with promoting and implementing the systemic approach to safety. And this is, as I said, this is where you'll find the Systemic Safety Project Selection Tool in a month or two when it is published. And we'll also take the results of the participant exercise at the end of this webinar and develop a fact sheet specific to pedestrian safety. So look for that in the next couple of weeks on our website. So what can you do to get started? Your presence here today confirms your interest in the systemic approach to safety. So I would encourage you to explore the website and see how you might incorporate the systemic approach into your current safety management efforts. Perhaps you might incorporate the systemic approach in your pedestrian safety action plan development or update efforts. Perhaps pedestrian safety is identified as a priority in your strategic highway safety plan, but it's been difficult for standalone safety projects to compete for limited safety funds, so the systemic approach might better position those projects to receive funding in the future. There are many opportunities to advance the systemic approach to safety in your agency. These are just a few. You might begin the process and build your case by identifying your data needs and potential risk factors. As I said earlier, the systemic approach has been focused on rural and local roads, so we're really looking for case studies to illustrate how this process has been used to support pedestrian safety programs. If you have a case study, I'm sure your peers online today would love to see it, so we would encourage you to share that with us, and there's functionality in the systemic website built in for you to be able to do that, to share those noteworthy practices and case studies with us. Also, if you're interested in applying the systemic approach and think you might need some help with that, let us know. We may have some resources, particularly if you're a focused state or city, to provide some additional training and technical assistance. So with that is all I have for now. We'll wait till the end of the presentations for questions. So Dan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Karen. And as Karen mentioned, we'll be having questions at the end. We'll be discussing those. So if you do have some questions about a presentation, if you could submit those to us, we'll receive them here and we'll incorporate them into the list that we're going to use. But for right now, what I'm going to do is turn it over for our next presentation to Howard Preston to talk about a case study involving the systemic tool. So Howard, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and take over the screen and begin your presentation.
All right, thank you. Dan, I'm assuming you can see the slides?
Not quite yet. Did a box pop up asking you if you want to accept the control of the screen? It might be waiting on you. There you go. Oh.
That work?
For a minute it did.
Uh-oh. How about now?
Yep, looks good.
Operator error. I apologize.
All right. Go right ahead. Thanks.
Good afternoon, folks. So, as Karen mentioned, what I'm going to share with you is some information about how we've applied this systemic method in Minnesota to particularly address the issue of pedestrian safety. And so, a little bit of information, some background information about a bigger process that's going on here called the County Road Safety Plans. I'll mention that. And then a little bit more about applying the process of identifying our target crash types, identifying risk factors, going through the process of screening locations, identifying countermeasures, and developing projects. And so go through all that just briefly, and it's all, again, based on what we're doing here in Minnesota, and it's just as an example of applying this process. Background, about 4 years ago, Minnesota decided to undertake a process to more fully engage local highway agencies here in Minnesota. That in Minnesota, about 50% of all the severe crashes are on local systems, and here local agencies own and operate about 90% of the system. There's 140,000 miles of roads in Minnesota. MnDOT owns and operates about 12,000, so the vast majority of our system here is owned and operated by local agencies. And for a lot of years, there was virtually no participation in the highway safety program on the part of these local agencies. And so with the last strategic safety plan here in Minnesota, there was this recognition that with half of these severe crashes on the local system, there needed to be something that would be done different in order to more fully engage and include these local agencies in the highway safety process. And through a variety of efforts on MnDOT's part, first they added a component to their highway safety program that was in fact systemic instead of just being focused on high crash locations, to allow these locations in where there may be no crash history at all. But then they concluded that in order to be able to help our local system engineers understand and analyze their system, MnDOT actually has funded a process to prepare a safety plan for every one of our 87 counties. Right now, 81 of those plans are complete, and we'll be delivering the last 6. The drafts will go out Thursday to the counties for their review. And so I'll talk a little bit more about, again, that process as we move forward here this afternoon. And then just a call out on this slide to, we've been helping Karen and Federal Highway document what this process is and make it available for the process for other agencies, and to make that available for supplementing their safety programs also. All right, so I won't spend a lot of time with this other than to say it's the same process Karen shared with you a few minutes ago, and it's saying it's all about prioritization. It's a multiple-step prioritization exercise, and it's suggesting that in many cases, every type of crash does not represent the same opportunity. There are simply more of certain types, and those would generally represent your best opportunity for making substantial reductions. In our rural counties here in Minnesota, it was road departure, and so the examples Karen showed you earlier were mostly focused in on road departure in the 81 counties that aren't our metropolitan area here around St. Paul and Minneapolis. It's about road departure, but I'll show you some data in just a minute that says in our metro counties, it turned out pedestrian and bicycle related crashes were one of these target crash types. And then to go along with that, though, it's also what are the places that are at risk, and trying to identify those candidate locations. And as Karen mentioned, with a focus on severe crashes, we've ended up looking across the entire local system here in Minnesota, tens of thousands of miles, tens of thousands of intersections, and tens of thousands of curves, horizontal curves in rural areas, and we've yet to find a single location that averaged a severe crash per year. And so it's just suggesting it doesn't appear to be a very efficient approach to generating a safety program to limit it to chasing those locations around the system where these few severe crashes do occur. It seemed like it was a better strategy to proactively identify places that would be candidates for investment, and then using these risk factors. And so I'll share with you what we learned as we focused in on the urban system here and pedestrians. But it's a similar kind of a process of going through and saying, what are the characteristics of the locations with crashes, and then using your efforts to do a census of the rest of the system, looking for places with similar characteristics. So that's this approach of identifying the crash type, what are the factors that are common at the places that have these types of severe crashes, searching through the system to find out what locations, other locations have those factors, going through a process of then selecting countermeasures. And if you identify particular crash types, it will help you prioritize the countermeasures, because there's really very few safety strategies that are mitigations for every kind of crash type. Some strategies are mitigations for road departure, some are mitigations for angle crashes at intersections, some for pedestrians. And so by targeting particular crash types, it also helps you screen through and develop this short list of priority strategies. For us, it was a lot to do with low cost, and it was because, again, there are so many locations across these systems, and so many even that had characteristics that you couldn't afford to spend a lot of money at any one location. So it was trying to get as many of these low-cost strategies spread across as much of the system as you possibly could. And then the final step, again, developing projects, and I'll show you examples of all of these as we walk through the rest of the presentation. This is what we call a crash tree Metro ATP, Area Transportation Partnership. It's what Minnesota calls their regions of the state. And so we're in the metropolitan region here. The two sets of numbers, the numbers in black are total crashes, the numbers in red are the severe crashes, and this first disaggregation was by system, and it shows that in our metropolitan area there are more severe crashes on county. CSAH is the county state aid system, and county roads. So we're focused in on the county system, and then we do the disaggregation that urban, rural, almost 90% of these severe crashes are urban. In Minnesota, that means being assigned to a city code. So that's in our crash record system. Any of these crashes that are within the corporate boundaries of cities get assigned a city code. And then disaggregating down through the rest of the numbers, ped bike-related crashes are about 21% of the severe crashes out on that county system. And then just to give you a sense of the other priority for our metropolitan area counties, if you follow intersection-related, 60% of the severe crashes intersection-related. Almost half of those are at traffic signals, and 52% of those are angle crashes. And so the types of crashes that were selected as priorities in our metropolitan area counties, ped bike crashes, and then angle crashes at signals. And so we further looked at then these pedestrian bike-related crashes, and over 65% of those were located at intersections. So that was the first clue for us as far as prioritizing let's start looking and focusing in on intersections. That's where the greatest numbers are. That seems to be where we can make the greatest difference. Then looking just again statewide, in a 5-year period, 972 severe ped bike crashes. Almost 65% of those are in our metropolitan area counties. And again, over 80% of those are on our local system. The map at the right, you can see where the cluster of red is. That's our metropolitan area counties. As we did the safety plans for the counties in rural Minnesota, ped bike types of crashes were never in numbers such that those were a priority for those counties. And so in all those other counties, it was primarily road departure or rural intersection related kinds of crashes. But again, in our metro area counties, that's where the focus is. It's almost 65% of all the ped bike crashes, the majority on our local systems. And then what we focused in on is this 40% or so that were on our county road system. So just some additional numbers again, but it's proving that this proactive systemic approach, again, almost 70% of the ped bike crashes occurred at intersections. However, in our metro area, we had almost 1,600 signalized intersections, and only 122 had of those. So, you know, that's got to be 8% or something, had a severe ped bike crash in the last 5 years, and only 14 had more than one, and none really averaged a severe ped bike crash per year. So with over 90% of the system having none of these types of crashes, it didn't make sense to focus only on the locations that did have the crash, the severe ped bike crash. Again, not to chase those around the system, but to say, okay, let's look at this entire system. Let's see where there would be candidates then for investment based on these characteristics. So again, it's just proving that, at least to satisfy ourselves, that this proactive systemic approach was an important thing to undertake in order to identify candidates for investment to mitigate these severe ped bike crashes. This happens to be a map of St. Paul, Minnesota, and the dots just show where the severe ped bike crashes occurred, and they were basically scattered across the system. They weren't even concentrated in downtown St. Paul. They were out primarily along the minor arterials and collectors through the rest of the city. But again, it's just suggesting that there was no place where severe ped bike crashes accumulated, and that we needed to take this other approach to identifying locations for investment. I had mentioned that intersections was the source of the location of almost 70% of these severe ped bike crashes, and we had the ability then to disaggregate across those intersections by intersection control. And 87% of these severe ped bike crashes occurred at traffic signals, and so 4% at all-way stops, 9% at through stops where the minor road is stopped. And so in this effort to prioritize and suggest places that ought to be the focus for investment to mitigate these severe ped bike crashes, we selected signalized intersections to be the focus of that effort. This is disaggregating by speed on the major road. In our metropolitan areas here in Minnesota, the statutory speed limit is 30, and 50% of these severe ped bike crashes occurred where the speed limit is 30, another 20% at 35, another 11% at 40, but it's basically saying that 80% of our severe ped bike crashes occurred where speeds were 40 or less. And so we picked these lower speed ranges to be the focus, again, of our attention as far as looking for candidates to make investments at for safety. This is disaggregation by volume, and so this is the total entering volumes daily traffic, but almost 60% were over 17,500 vehicles a day. And so we were looking for other intersections then in our system that had this higher volume range. So we're starting again to focus in on the types of characteristics of the places that we would think would be the most at risk. And this is just summarizing what we ended up using for risk factors here in the metropolitan area. Signalized intersections, speed limit, so we were looking again for 40 and under. Four-legged intersections had a higher density of crashes than T intersections, for example. Multi-lane undivided roadways. Locations with bus stops seemed to be also overrepresented. And pedestrian generators. And so we took that to mean as some type of a retail establishment in one of the corners of the intersections. We also looked at the presence of crosswalks as being an indicator, but it turned out that virtually all of these crashes occurred at places that had crosswalks. And so the presence of a crosswalk didn't appear to distinguish these locations as being more at risk. And we also looked at streetlights and decided not to use streetlights because, again, virtually all of the places where these crashes occurred had streetlights, so those turned out, it appeared not to be a differentiator. And so what we ended up doing then is looking at the rest of the system, and this was a virtual look. We used a combination of video logs that were available or from Google Earth, the street views. And so we used photography of some type to do this census of all of the intersections along the corridors that were part of the county system here in the metropolitan area, and then looking for these factors at these intersections that represented additional risk. And so again, I want to emphasize we're not suggesting that the presence of any of these factors causes crashes. What we are suggesting, though, is based on a review of all this data that the presence of these factors appear to indicate a greater level of risk. And so we're focused in then on finding places that had these kinds of characteristics and evaluating them for a variety of different kinds of investments. This wasn't a risk factor, but we were curious. We were wondering the age distribution and to just see concern, was there an overrepresentation of school-age kids, for example, and were the crashes located at places where we knew schools and parks to be located in our metropolitan area? That turned out not to be the case. You can see the ages that appear to be most overrepresented, and it didn't appear to be the school-age kids, and certainly not the time of day also when school-age kids would have been present. All right, so what we have here is examples of what we provide to each of our metropolitan counties that shows then the listing. So it shows the ranking of intersections. So this happens to be from Ramsey County, which is St. Paul, Minnesota, and its suburbs. The #1 intersection shown here was University Avenue at Snelling Avenue, and of the risk factors that were present, there were 6 of these risk factors present. The next intersection was White Bear Avenue at Jarvis, then University Avenue at Marion Street, but we gave then the counties this rank order listing. And then what you see, though, below is a listing by corridor, because the notion was, even though that we evaluated intersections based on the presence of these factors, that the notion was to assemble these into corridors and suggest then for projects implementation across the corridors. So it may be that 3 or 5 or 6 intersections in these corridors appeared to be more at risk than others, but since we're focused in on low-cost kinds of strategies, the idea was to try to blanket these corridors then that seems to be more at risk with with safety strategies, mitigations for pedestrian types of crashes. So this just happens to be an example. It's County Highway 49, which turns out to be Rice Street in St. Paul, Minnesota. And at the signalized and unsignalized intersections, we've suggested a variety of strategies, an advanced walk cycle at traffic signals, countdown timers, curb extensions, medians, those kinds of things. So again, the point here is the intersections were evaluated on the basis of the presence of risk factors, but then those intersections were organized into discrete corridors, and then the corridors were suggested for projects. This is just a map of Ramsey County, and it's just identifying the corridors where we had suggested projects. And so again, it's just reinforcing this notion of apply the risk factors at individual intersections, but accumulate them into logical corridors or corridors with logical termini, like segments, where the projects could be implemented across the entire corridor. All right, where do we get the strategies? Primarily, they came from the NCHRP 500 series guides, and we started there in all cases with our county road safety plans. For road departure crashes, we started there for rural intersections, urban intersections, pedestrian kinds of things, rather than try to reinvent the entire process. We started with these documents. We then updated them based on information as far as effectiveness using the Federal Highway CMF Clearinghouse. And then what I'll also mention is we're working with Minnesota's Charlie Zagier at North Carolina to develop a handbook of pedestrian and bike safety. It's due out this summer, but again, it's trying to accumulate information that says what is the experience working with a variety of pedestrian safety strategies. For example, crosswalks and medians, and this is information you'd be familiar with that Charlie Zagier has published, which suggests the presence of a median is in fact a pedestrian safety strategy, and the mere presence of a crosswalk may not be, depending on a variety of conditions. We've also looked into things like curb extensions, hawk signals, bike boulevards. So we screened through a variety of those kinds of strategies, and then for the county road safety plans, focused in on countdown timers, and that's a strategy that has been used at a number of locations here in our metropolitan area, but normally they're applied, added when the intersections are being reconstructed, and at least in our metropolitan area, that's being done at maybe 1% a year. So even though countdown timers have been used for a number of years, it's still a minority of our intersections that have these countdown timers. And given that the countdown timers are about $10,000 to add to the intersection, and there's some indication that the presence of these timers has been effective, we focused in on adding the countdown timers at signalized intersections. The use of the leading pedestrian interval, there's basically no implementation costs. It's simply a matter of adjusting the signal controller to provide pedestrians with a head start at the intersections. And I know a number of other metropolitan areas have been using this for years. It's just never been used here in our metropolitan area before. And it's not a proven effective strategy yet, but the Crash Modification Factor Clearinghouse has a number of research articles now that talk about the crash reductions associated with this. So the data is really pointing towards these leading pedestrian intervals to be an effective safety device. The other types of strategies we're using, curb extensions, and at places particularly where there's on-street parking to shadow the parking areas. Medians, and I'll put the caveat in, only in places where the roadway is already wide enough because the cost would be too high if we were talking about widening a roadway to provide the medians. We limited the suggestions for medians to places where, again, the roads are wide enough without widening and having to move sidewalks and acquiring right-of-way and buildings and things like that. And then across our metropolitan area, there's a few locations on urban arterials where sidewalks are not in place, and we worked with the individual county staff to identify those locations and to identify candidates potentially for the installation of sidewalks. Just some information about effectiveness again, and it's places where we've gone to look to see what the crash reductions are, but it's basically just proving to ourselves that by focusing in on the leading pedestrian interval, the countdown timers, medians, curb extensions, those kinds of things, that we were confident that the installation of those strategies would in fact lead to a reduction in these severe ped bike kinds of crashes. Karen mentioned earlier and showed you a decision tree that had to do for rural applications. This was the decision tree we used to help us decide what kind of project to suggest across this metropolitan area. And again, we wanted a measure of consistency. So what we did is focus in on first the intersection type. If it was signalized, were countdown timers present? If yes, then the application was simply to add the advanced walk. The answer was no. It was to add the countdown timers and the advanced walk. If the unsignalized intersections was on-street parking present, if that answer was yes, then the application was curb extensions. No, or if there was space available in the median, it was looking at doing some type of median refuge island. And what we primarily did here is find locations where there may have been a 3 or 5 lane roadway, but there might be some intersecting streets that are one way, such that a left turn wasn't available in a certain direction at a certain intersection, and the suggestion would be to provide some type of raised island out there that would replace a turn lane that was merely striped out because that left turn movement wasn't available. So this was the decision tree that we used to generate projects across the metropolitan area, again, to generate proactive, low-cost kinds of projects. And this is an example from Ramsey County, which is St. Paul and its suburbs. We had one corridor, County Road H, between Silver Lake Road and County Highway 10, sidewalks. So $171,000 to complete the sidewalk system. County Road D between Chandler and Joanna Boulevard, it was countdown timers, advanced walks at half a dozen intersections. It was a median at one location, $30,000. You can go down the list. For Ramsey County, we had suggested 143 intersections that had some type of signal work, a combination of countdown timers and the advanced walk, 12 locations for curb extensions, 5 locations for medians, and that one location on County Road H for sidewalks. And so we identified $1.7 million worth of pedestrian-related projects. Adding in our other metropolitan area counties, we were something over $3 million of pedestrian-related strategies that were suggested by corridor. So again, these are all corridors. They may be half a mile long, they might be 3 miles long, but they're corridors that had logical termini from the perspective of the county staff that we were working with. And so, I mean, if the question was when we started, gee, we knew we could apply this systemic method to identify places in rural areas where road departure was an issue, could we also use a version of that methodology to identify candidate locations in urban areas for pedestrian-related crashes? Again, none of these projects have been implemented yet, but we've successfully identified several $1 million worth of pedestrian-oriented safety kinds of projects across this metropolitan area based on the presence of these risk factors as opposed to only the presence of pedestrian-related crashes. And then just as an example, one of the things that we're doing with these safety plans, we found out as we went through this process, and the idea again is to provide every county in Minnesota with a list of projects that they could get into the statewide highway safety improvement program, is that county staff really didn't like filling out the paperwork, and when they did, they frequently got it wrong, and it turned out that all of the information that the MnDOT folks needed to prioritize projects were in the computer that we had, the software that was generating this list of projects. So what this actually is an example of a solicitation form for a project on Rice Street in Ramsey County, and it says for $215,000. The idea would be to look at a variety of safety strategies and suggest which ones, but this is actually the solicitation form to get into the HSIP process. And for every project and every one of these county safety plans that we've suggested, the solicitation form is already there. So all the county engineer has to do is take this form out of their plan and send it in. Now that doesn't guarantee that the project will be funded, but it has increased the participation rate, having these forms available, having the plans done, and in the last 2 years, MnDOT has directed over $33 million to projects on the local system that have come through this particular process. So just to wrap up, again, we were confident and demonstrated a number of times that we could use this systemic method in rural areas, and then the question was, would it also work in an urban area? And so we identified that pedestrian crashes, severe ped bike kinds of crashes, occurred at widely scattered locations across our metropolitan area, seem to be candidates for identification through this systemic risk assessment method, and we've then also proven that not every intersection or segment of road is equally at risk. Even though these crashes are scattered, they appear to be overrepresented along certain corridors and at certain intersections, and so we've applied these risk assessments, hundreds of locations, hundreds of miles of this urban county system, and then have identified, as I mentioned, about $1.7 million of ped bike kinds of improvements in Ramsey County and in the other counties, and just in our metropolitan area, the ped bike crashes or mitigation projects are up over $3 million, and we've identified another $9 million in these urban counties of other types of low-cost kinds of projects, again, mostly at traffic signals. So our conclusion is this systemic process using risk assessment and risk factors appears to work to identify these kinds of candidates, and sufficient enough anyway to develop projects and get projects into the HSIP program. So with that, I will finish up, and Dan, I think we have time for questions if there are any.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. I appreciate the presentation, and what we're going to do before we start the question and answer period, we do have a few more poll questions that we'd like to ask you all. So what I'm going to do is we're going to launch a few poll questions here specifically related to certain risk factors for various types of pedestrian crashes that you all might have some experience with. So as these questions come up, what we're going to ask you to do is identify the top 3 risk factors of the choices that we have. We're going to ask you to identify the top 3 that you, in your experience, have seen associated with these 3 different types of pedestrian crashes. So we're going to look at walking along the roadway crashes, crashes involving pedestrians crossing the roadway, and then pedestrian dart dash crashes. So I'm going to launch the first poll question here, which has to do with walking along roadway crashes. And so what we'd like to ask you to do is pick 3 of these risk factors that you've noticed in your work as being more highly involved with these types of crashes. And Karen, I'll open it up to you as well if you want to talk through any of this.
Sure. So, one of the most frequently asked questions we get about the systemic approach is, well, what are these risk factors? And since the idea of applying the systemic approach to pedestrian safety is relatively new, we thought this would be a good opportunity to get input from you all. So the first poll question is asking, based on your experience, and this will likely vary by state and even local agency, but select the top 3 risk factors associated with pedestrian, and in this case, walking along the roadway crashes. That might be presence of shoulders or sidewalks, speed, presence of lighting, time of day, or the walking direction of the pedestrian, whether they were facing traffic or not. And if you, based on your experience or data analysis, know of a risk factor that you think is in the top 3, but it's not listed here, you can go ahead and put that in the chat pod and send that on to Dan for recording.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so we're gonna. People are still voting, so we want to make sure we have time for everybody to provide their input. Just a reminder, please just select the top 3 from this list. I'm sure that everyone has seen these associated with crashes in some way, but if you can just pick the 3 top choices that you'd like to put down, that'll help us with the poll. And as soon as we get some more votes here, I'm going to close the poll and I'll actually share it with everyone so you can all see sort of how everyone else has voted too, because it's always interesting to see if your experience is similar to others in other areas. So we'll give it just another minute to go through some of these, and we'll have another question coming up related to the crossing crashes. Probably give it 15 more seconds for you to cast your votes. If you haven't done so already, please do that now. We'll also collect that feedback we're getting through the chat pods. If you don't see your choice listed here, please send a note to us. We'd be glad to receive it that way as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll, and I'm going to share it with everybody and see what you think. It looks like we had about 82% chose the presence of a shoulder or sidewalk, and that was the top choice. That received the most votes, and 63% chose speed, 56 and 56 tied for lighting and time of day, and 26% for walking direction, whether someone was walking with or against traffic. So what I'll do now is open our next poll question, and this one is related to crossing the road crashes. So for these risk factors that you see listed here, from your experience, identify the top 3 that you consider to be associated with the with crossing the road crashes.
Okay, so again, based on your experience, we're asking you to select the top 3 risk factors associated with pedestrian crossing crashes. So this might be presence or proximity of pedestrian generators, number of lanes, proximity of established pedestrian crossings, responsiveness of the pedestrian signal, or how long the pedestrian has to wait to be able to cross the street, and traffic volume. And these are just 5 that we picked. If you think that, if you have another choice that's not listed here that you think is one of your top 3, the same as before, please go ahead and enter that in the chat pod.
All right.
And I'm sure,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm sure you're seeing lots of responses come in the chat pod, because I know our initial list, we had at least 15 on our initial list.
Yeah, well, lighting is definitely coming in as one here that that wasn't listed, but it certainly seems a lot of people are identifying lighting as a risk factor for the crossing the road crashes as well. Right. So I'll go ahead and close this poll, and let me show it to everybody to show you how everybody voted. So looks like leading the way is number of lanes. 80% of you identified number of lanes as the top risk factor, or one of the top risk factors for crossing the road crashes, followed by traffic volume, 72%, and those are very related to each other. I guess one could be indicative of the other. 65% with presence, proximity of pedestrian generators. 45% shows the proximity of established pedestrian crossings, and then 28% was responsiveness of the signal or wait time as being a risk factor for those crashes. So we'll just launch one more poll here, the final one of the day, and this is this one has the same question, but it has to do with pedestrian dash or dart crashes. So these are the crashes where pedestrian either ran into the roadway suddenly or walked into the roadway when their view was obstructed by a driver. Somewhat different from the crossing crashes, although very related. There's sometimes this confusion between the two. So you might think of similar risk factors for this one. But we'll leave that one open and let everybody vote for a little bit.
Okay, so like Dan said, this is the last one. So again, based on your experience, and that may vary whether you're state or local agency, select the top 3 risk factors associated with pedestrian dart or dash crashes. These might be presence of on-street parking, lighting, traffic volume, and sex of drivers and pedestrians, or sight distance. And again, same as before, if you have a risk factor in mind that's not on our list, but it's in your top 3, please go ahead and send that along in the chat pod.
Okay. Still accepting some really good feedback through the question area, the chat pod. A lot of people mentioning a driver or pedestrian impairment, alcohol impairment or drug involvement in those crashes. That seems to be a common one. Also, vehicle speed, because of course that might impact how quickly a driver could identify a pedestrian. So how fast they're traveling is certainly a big risk factor to identify there. Maybe 15 more seconds on this poll question, and we'll close it up and share the results, and then we'll start a little Q&A period with the time we have remaining. Okay, I'll go ahead and close the poll and then share it with everybody. You should be able to see the results here. 70%, pretty close between presence of on-street parking with 70% and sight distance at 69%. Because you can think about pedestrians running out behind parked cars that certainly are coming out from behind parked cars. It's difficult for drivers to see them. 61% was next to traffic volume, 50% age or sex of the driver or pedestrian, and then 40% chose lighting. So some similar risk factors there for the crossing crashes, but certainly a sort of a different set of issues. So we really appreciate your feedback on that, and as Karen mentioned, hopefully we'll be able to use these results and help put those on the site and help steer people toward the right resources. It's helpful to know what sorts of things people are seeing with their local communities in pedestrian crashes and risk factors for those as well. So we do appreciate your feedback on that. All right, we do have some time remaining for questions today, maybe about 15 minutes or so. So up on the screen here, I'll just let you know we do have a link to our archive page where we're going to be posting some additional materials related to the webinar, stuff like presentation slides, the recording, and also some email addresses here. So if you don't get your question answered, and we do have a lot of those coming in, if we don't get to it today, please do send those along to the presenters or to myself, the general webinar account here. We can certainly respond to those. But let me go ahead and start reading through some of the questions here that we received. One of the first questions had to do with the types of data that can be used to help identify high priority areas. So clearly you're using crash data, police crash reports to look at your high priority areas, but there were just some other questions about what other types of data might be available to identify high priority areas. One specifically was mentioned about pedestrian falls and maybe hospital records to show maybe some injuries that aren't captured in crash data but can still lead to identifying areas that are in need of improvement. Have you had any experience using any other types of data to identify these locations other than the crash data itself? And I'll open that up to Karen or Howard, whoever would like to respond.
Dan, this is Howard. No, we didn't have access to beyond the crash records, and it's actually here. It's only a summary of the police crash record. So there's a piece of software that Minnesota uses. It's called a crash mapping analysis tool, and it's updated annually with the new series of the latest years of crash data, and there's some information about roadway characteristics and certainly location and that kind of thing. But beyond that, no, we didn't even get into the actual police reports, and we certainly didn't get into the hospital records. What we use beyond that, and I mentioned, we have primarily photography, video logs, aerial photography, and then when we got down to specific corridors, the counties were able to share with us information that they had about roadway characteristics and those kinds of things. So it was mostly geometry-related things beyond the crash data that came from this piece of software that Minnesota uses. Okay.
All right. Well, and going along with that same sort of idea about data quality, there was a point made by one of the participants about how in the past, pedestrian and bicycle crash data may have been spotty or lacking some detail that was available for motor vehicle crash data. Can you speak at all about the current state of the pedestrian and bicycle crash data that you're using for these types of projects, and whether or not there are still improvements to be made in terms of availability and quality of pedestrian and bicycle crash data?
Dan, we look again using this crash analysis tool. It's based on the police records and focusing in on the severe crashes. So in Minnesota, it's a priority to focus in on the fatal and then A injury or serious injury crashes. We did a check in our metropolitan area of locational accuracy, and they were something on the order of 95 or 96% accurate. So from that perspective, they're very accurate. Beyond that, we never did a check to see how accurate they are, but again, we've heard no complaints from any of the participants, the partners in this effort, about the accuracy of the data. But again, it's limited to mostly locational kinds of things, and certainly time of day, day of week. We have the ages of the folks that are involved, and then most of what the rest of it is roadway geometry, speed. I can't remember all the rest, but again, when we've checked the locational part of it, that has proven to be extremely accurate. The officers do a very good job, particularly these more severe crashes, of identifying the location, and we haven't heard any concerns about the accuracy beyond that.
Okay, great. Thank you for responding to that. Karen, did you have an answer?
If I could just chime in. Minnesota is fortunate to have pretty good data, and I know that's not the case in all of the states across the nation. So I think there are still some quality issues associated with pedestrian and bicycle crash data. I think it's getting better. States are moving to more complete and accurate data systems, but I think there are still issues. I think the systemic approach allows you to look at that data from an aggregate basis, and then once you've identified your risk factors, if you don't have the data to do that, you can do that using the research that's already out there, and also and then go out and collect data just for those risk factors. So you're not collecting system-wide data of all potential roadway elements, but only those ones that might be influencing potential crashes. So I think data quality is still an issue, but we can use the data that we do have to advance implementation of the systemic approach.
Okay, thank you, Karen. And I will mention, I'll put in a plug here, that some agencies are using a tool called PBCAT, or the Pedestrian and Bicycle Crash Analysis tool, which can be helpful in taking the existing crash data and typing it, identifying, reading through the reports, and adding some additional, ped bike features to those crashes. So I know many agencies are using that. It's available online if you're interested in downloading that, but it can be a useful resource as well. I wanted to ask about one of the statistics that Karen, you shared, and something that Howard mentioned in his presentation. You mentioned, Karen, in the early part of your presentation, that nationally 79% of the crashes, I think it's just pedestrian crashes, are at non-intersection locations. And then Howard, you mentioned in your analysis in Minnesota, around 70% of the severe pedestrian and bicycle crashes were at intersection locations. Did you identify any maybe reasons for why those were different? Was it sort of an urban issue as opposed to looking at just national data with those differences there?
Well, I'll start. Yeah, I don't know that we compared notes before the presentation. The data that I presented is national fatality data only,
right?
As compared to Howard presented Minnesota data for fatal and serious injury crashes. So I think it's a good question. I don't know if we know the answer unless Howard has any insights.
Well, I think Howard, yours included bicycle crashes as well, whereas I think Karen's was pedestrian too, so that might impact that as well. It was just interesting to note that there was that sort of difference, and it might be just maybe an urban issue.
Well, that was I was going to go to, Dan, is that, remember, we focused in, that number was for our metropolitan area. My guess is that in rural Minnesota, a big chunk of those crashes, so that was the other 36%, my guess would have been more oriented towards not at intersections. And then the other thing that we can do here is we can put buffers around intersections, and I can't remember exactly right off the top of my head how much of a buffer we used in our metro area, but we were probably looking at the intersection plus or minus either 100 feet or 200 feet. I can't remember which. So, you know, if it was within that buffer, we called it intersection related.
Okay. Great. Thank you for that. There's a question about, you talked mostly about this metropolitan area application of this tool. Is this, or this process, is this also something that you could see as being effective on a larger scale, such as maybe a statewide planning effort, or even looking at just a corridor-wide analysis?
Well, certainly we've applied it to all 87 counties, and I know MnDOT has applied it to their districts. So it really has been applied across the state, but not looking just at statewide data. It seems that looking at least things regionally is a better way of doing that. If we don't, my observation, you know, Minnesota, there's the metropolitan area and there's everything else. And if you put all that data together, it appears to me you pollute things. It becomes harder to see. If you separate the metropolitan area out from the rest of Minnesota, differences become more sharp. So in greater Minnesota, it's more of a focus on road departure things. And in the metropolitan area, there's this focus on pedestrians that if you had looked at all the data together, the number of pedestrian-related crashes may not have risen to be the priority it is if you only look at the metro area. So I think the process, I mean, it can look at any data set you want. I think you need to ask yourself, which one do you want to look at, and are there differences? And it may suggest that that you do some disaggregations before you apply the process.
Okay, thank you. One question about whether you looked at the presence of a marked crosswalk as a risk factor, and if so, if you look separately at type of crosswalk marking or the condition of the pavement marking.
We only look for the presence.
Okay.
And in Minnesota, there aren't a lot of different types. I mean, so it's primarily I think in the photos what we showed is, you know, it's the parallel lines that cross the street, and then the boxes that avoid the wheel paths is primarily what we use for the marked crosswalks. And so, okay. But no, we did not look at the condition of that either.
Okay. And then finally, I know you shared a slide about the intersection, looking at the risk factor of intersection traffic volumes. Did you look also at the number of travel lanes? It seems like those are interrelated. You know, that you could suggest that the number of travel lanes increases, you're going to see higher traffic volumes. But did you look specifically at the number of travel lanes versus one lane in each direction?
Yes, they were multi-lane undivided is primarily what we focused in on.
Okay.
we also found some multi-lane divided, but it was primarily the multi-lane kinds of facilities that we focused in on.
I see. Okay. And since you focused on the, you were focusing on the metropolitan areas, when you selected a corridor for analysis, how did you go about selecting the start and end points for that corridor? Some folks were interested in, where along the corridor they need to be focusing to begin their analysis.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, we did coordinate with the county staff and say, okay, we're looking at this piece of Rice Street. What makes sense to you as a starting and ending point? And I guess, we tried to avoid really short corridors for a whole lot of reasons. But it was, if the corridor itself was uniform from, across the county in speed, the volumes were relatively similar, the cross-section was similar, then it kind of came down to, okay, county, what makes sense to you? Would you like to divide this up, or do you want to look at it as one entire corridor? And so we used the presence of these characteristics. Again, if the speed was the same, if the volumes were similar, if the cross-section was similar, we said that's a corridor. And we looked for anomalies then to divide the corridors up.
Okay. And you mentioned some of the work that was done, to really prepare the data, summarize the data to be available for going through this process. Do you have any sense of what type of effort it took to get the data in a position to be ready for analysis before the analysis could be done, and then finally the projects could be selected for implementation? What sort of effort would that take for an agency to go through that process?
That's where the bulk of the effort was by analysts. I mean, first it was to identify the corridors, identify the intersections, use the various records either the county could provide us or the aerial photography and video logs, identify all the signalized intersections since that's what we were focused in on, the characteristics, the number of the factors present. So that's where the bulk of the effort went, is to do that analysis. It was done at desks using electronics kinds of things. We did not do in the field kinds of work. There's just too many miles and too many intersections to do that, but we would confirm things with the county staff and then develop the projects. But that's where the bulk of the effort was, and it was all done using or recorded. I mean, it was Excel spreadsheets. It wasn't anything terribly fancy.
Sure.
And so, but that is where the bulk of the effort was, and it probably took an analyst several months to go through all of that data in the individual counties.
Okay. I mean, we have time for one final question here, and it's related to sort of the other side of the data, which is exposure data. And you mentioned, you looked specifically, I know, at one analysis or risk factor of pedestrian bicycle age. In the absence of good pedestrian bicycle exposure data, what can agencies use to really look at those age groups as they break down in the crashes versus knowing whether or not those ages are truly overrepresented or underrepresented in the crashes without really having good count data and knowing who is out there? And how did you address that in this project?
Well, I think we tried to address it again by using these risk factors to just identify where most of these crashes happen, and we don't have access to ped counts or bike counts. That isn't something that is done routinely here, and so what we tried to do is suggest, again, if there's a pedestrian generator in the corner, you'd likely have a higher number of pedestrians. If it's a bus stop, you'll have a higher number of pedestrians. So it's trying to use those kinds of surrogates. We did look at the age again just to see if that appeared to be overrepresented. To us, it did not. Plus, there's already an active Safe Routes to School program here that focuses on those younger kinds of kids and walking to school. And so we thought we would not focus on that just because, one, the data didn't suggest that the age ranges, again, was primarily older adults even. So we tried to use those risk factors to identify places where there would be pedestrians accumulating, and then to focus in on those kinds of places, irrespective of the actual numbers.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think with that, I'll conclude the Q&A for the day. I'll just let our presenters, if you have any final comments, Karen or Howard, anything else you'd like to share before we close out for the day?
Just to thank everybody for investing a little time with us, and hopefully there's one or two things that they could use on their own systems.
Great, thank you.
I couldn't say anything better than that, so thank you all for your time today. Great,
thank you. And I'll be sure to share the website link with everyone. You look for that in that email that's going to be coming this afternoon after the webinar. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have for discussion. If we weren't able to respond to your questions, we do hope that you'll be able to follow up with us individually, with our presenters or with myself. You can use the webinars account here on the page. And then once again, we will have a recording of today's program available on our archive page, and we'll have some of the slides up online as well. You'll see a link to that page in the email that should be coming to you this afternoon. That email is also going to include the link where you can download your certificate of attendance for the webinar showing the hours of instruction completed and all that. I want to remind you all as well that there will be a brief survey that will appear when you exit the webinar today. We really appreciate you taking a moment to complete that and provide some feedback to us on our performance today. And so I just want to say thank you again to our speakers, and thanks to all of you for attending today's pedestrian-focused webinar, and I hope you have a great day.